In the annals of human history, there exists a moment when the gentle soul of a pacifist transforms into the fierce heart of a revolutionary, when the advocate for peaceful change becomes the architect of armed resistance, and when the believer in dialogue accepts the harsh reality that sometimes justice must be carved from the stone of oppression with the blade of necessity. This is the story of Nelson Mandela's transformation from peaceful activist to revolutionary leader, a journey that would cost him 27 years of his life behind bars, but would ultimately help dismantle one of the most brutal systems of racial oppression the world has ever known. The year was 1961, and the winds of change that had swept across Africa were being met with an iron wall of resistance in South Africa. The apartheid regime, that monstrous system that had reduced millions of black South Africans to second-class citizens in their own homeland, showed no signs of yielding to peaceful protests, international pressure, or moral appeals. For decades, the African National Congress had pursued a path of non-violent resistance, organizing boycotts, strikes, and peaceful demonstrations, believing that reason and justice would eventually prevail over prejudice and hatred. Nelson Mandela, then a young lawyer and rising star within the ANC, had been one of the most vocal advocates for this peaceful approach, inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's successful campaign of passive resistance in India. But as the 1960s dawned, it became increasingly clear that the apartheid government had no intention of negotiating or compromising, and wounding hundreds more served as a brutal wake-up call to those who still believed in the possibility of peaceful change. The government's response was swift and merciless. They banned the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress, declared a state of emergency, and arrested thousands of activists. The message was unmistakable. Peaceful resistance would be met with violent suppression, and any attempt at dialogue would be crushed with an iron fist. It was against this backdrop of escalating oppression and governmental intransigence that Mandela began to question the effectiveness of non-violent resistance. In countless sleepless nights, wrestling with his conscience and the weight of responsibility for his people's freedom, he came to a painful but inevitable conclusion. The time for purely peaceful protest had passed. The apartheid regime understood only the language of force, and if black South Africans were to have any hope of achieving equality and human dignity, they would need to speak that language with clarity and conviction. The decision to embrace armed resistance was not made lightly or in haste. Mandela and his colleagues spent months debating the moral implications, the practical challenges, and the potential consequences of abandoning their commitment to nonviolence. They understood that once they crossed this threshold, there would be no turning back, and that they would be branded as terrorists by the government and potentially lose the moral high ground that had given their struggle its legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. But as Mandela would later explain in his autobiography, they faced a stark choice. They could continue to pursue peaceful means while their people suffered under increasingly brutal oppression, or they could take up arms and fight for their freedom with the same determination that their oppressors showed in denying it to them. In 1961, Mandela played a pivotal role in the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, which translates to Spear of the Nation in Zulu. This military wing of the ANC was conceived not as a tool of indiscriminate violence, but as a carefully calibrated instrument of resistance that would target government installations, military facilities, and symbols of apartheid power while avoiding civilian casualties wherever possible. The decision to focus on sabotage rather than guerrilla warfare reflected Mandela's continued hope that the government might eventually come to its senses and enter into meaningful negotiations before the conflict escalated into a full-scale civil war. The early operations of Umkhonto we Sizwe were marked by their precision and restraint. Power stations, government offices, and transportation networks were targeted in coordinated attacks designed to demonstrate the movement's capability while minimizing loss of life. Mandela himself underwent military training, traveling secretly to Algeria and other African countries to learn the techniques of guerrilla warfare and to build relationships with other liberation movements across the continent. He emerged from this experience transformed, no longer just a lawyer and political organizer, but a revolutionary leader prepared to wage war against one of the most powerful military machines in Africa. But the apartheid security forces were not idle during this period. They had spent decades perfecting their surveillance techniques and building an extensive network of informants, and they were determined to crush this new threat before it could gain momentum. The net was closing around Mandela and his fellow revolutionaries, and everyone involved knew that capture would mean either death or a lifetime behind bars. The stakes could not have been higher, not just for the individuals involved, but for the entire liberation struggle and the millions of black South Africans whose hopes for freedom rested on their shoulders. The beginning of the end came in 1962, when Mandela was arrested while traveling in disguise through Natal province. The charges initially seemed manageable: incitement to strike and leaving the country without a passport, but the security forces were gathering evidence for something far more serious. They had been monitoring Umkhonto Sizwe operations, infiltrating the organization, and building a case that would allow them to deal with the leadership once and for all. The arrest of Mandela was just the opening move in what would become known as the Rivonia Trial, one of the most significant political trials of the 20th century. On July 11, 1963, police raided Liliesleaf Farm in Rivonia, a suburb of Johannesburg that had served as the secret headquarters of Umkhonto Sizwe. The raid netted a treasure trove of documents, weapons, and most importantly, several key leaders of the organization, including Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, and Ahmed Kathrada. Mandela, already in custody, found himself facing charges that carried the death penalty: sabotage, conspiracy to overthrow the government, and treason against the state. The evidence against him and his co-accused was overwhelming. The security forces had documents in his own handwriting detailing plans for guerrilla warfare, records of his military training abroad, and testimony from informants who had infiltrated the organization. The Rivonia Trial, which began on October 9, 1963, was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a battle for the soul of South Africa and the legitimacy of the liberation struggle. The apartheid government saw it as an opportunity to decapitate the resistance movement and demonstrate to the world that they would not tolerate any challenge to white minority rule. For Mandela and his co-accused, it was a chance to put apartheid itself on trial, to use the courtroom as a platform to articulate their vision of a free and democratic South Africa, and to explain to the world why they had been forced to abandon peaceful resistance in favor of armed struggle. Mandela's statement from the dock on April 20, 1964, remains one of the most powerful and eloquent defenses of revolutionary action ever delivered in a courtroom. Speaking for over 4 hours, he traced the history of his people's oppression, explained the rationale for the ANC's turn to violence, and articulated a vision of a non-racial democracy that would guarantee equal rights for all South Africans regardless of color. His words rang with moral authority and political clarity as he declared his willingness to die for his beliefs, stating that the ideal of a democratic and free society was one for which he was prepared to die. But the apartheid justice system was not moved by moral arguments or political vision. On June 12, 1964, Mandela and 7 of his co-accused were found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. The death penalty, which many had expected, was avoided, but the sentence was devastating nonetheless. At the age of 45, Mandela faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars, separated from his family, his comrades, and the struggle that had given his life meaning and purpose. The immediate aftermath of the Rivonia Trial saw the liberation movement in South Africa driven underground or into exile. Umkhonto Sizwe operations continued sporadically, but the arrest of the leadership had dealt a severe blow to the organization's effectiveness. The apartheid government seemed to have won a decisive victory, crushing the most significant challenge to white minority rule and demonstrating to the world their determination to maintain power at any cost. But they had underestimated the symbolic power of their prisoners and the galvanizing effect that the trial would have on international opinion. As Mandela began his long journey through the South African prison system, first to the notorious Robben Island and later to Pollsmoor Prison and Victor Verster Prison, his transformation from revolutionary leader to global icon was just beginning. The harsh conditions of imprisonment, the back-breaking labor, the isolation from family and friends, and the constant psychological pressure applied by prison authorities were designed to break the spirit of the prisoners and reduce them to mere numbers in the apartheid penal system. But Mandela and his fellow political prisoners refused to be broken, maintaining their dignity, their political beliefs, and their commitment to the struggle for freedom, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. The prison years were marked by a complex dance between the apartheid authorities and their most famous prisoner. While the government publicly maintained that Mandela was a terrorist who deserved his fate, they gradually came to realize that he represented something far more dangerous to their system: the embodiment of Black South African aspirations for freedom and equality. His continued imprisonment became a rallying cry for the anti-apartheid movement around the world, and his name became synonymous with the struggle against racial oppression. The more the government tried to silence him, the louder his voice became in the international arena. During his years in prison, Mandela underwent yet another transformation. The fiery revolutionary who had advocated armed struggle evolved into a statesman and negotiator, someone who understood that the ultimate goal was not military victory over the apartheid regime, but the creation of a new South Africa based on reconciliation and shared prosperity. He began to engage with his captors in a dialogue about the future of the country, demonstrating the same strategic thinking and political acuity that had made him such an effective leader of the liberation struggle. The international campaign for Mandela's release gathered momentum throughout the 1970s and 1980s, fueled by the growing global awareness of apartheid's brutalities and the moral clarity of the anti-apartheid cause. Sanctions, boycotts, and diplomatic pressure gradually isolated the apartheid regime, making it increasingly difficult for them to maintain their system of racial oppression. The Cold War context that had once provided them with Western support began to shift, and by the late 1980s it was clear that change was inevitable. When Mandela finally walked free on February 11, 1990, after 27 years in prison, he emerged not as a broken man seeking revenge, but as a leader committed to negotiation, reconciliation, and the peaceful transition to democracy. The armed struggle that had begun with the formation of Umkhonto Sizwe had served its purpose, demonstrating to the apartheid regime that the cost of maintaining white minority rule would be prohibitively high while providing the liberation movement with the credibility and leverage necessary to force negotiations. The story of Mandela's turn to armed resistance is not just a chapter in South African history. It is a testament to the power of moral courage in the face of seemingly insurmountable oppression, a reminder that sometimes the pursuit of justice requires individuals to make sacrifices that transcend their own immediate interests, and a demonstration that even the most entrenched systems of injustice can be overcome when ordinary people find the extraordinary courage to stand up for what is right. As we reflect on this pivotal moment in the struggle against apartheid, we must remember that Mandela's decision to embrace armed resistance was not born of hatred or a desire for revenge, but of love. Love for his people, love for justice, and love for the vision of a better world. His willingness to sacrifice his own freedom for the freedom of others, to risk his life for the principles he believed in, and to endure decades of imprisonment while never losing sight of his ultimate goal, stands as one of the most inspiring examples of moral leadership in human history. Today, as we face our own challenges and injustices, we must ask ourselves, what are we willing to sacrifice for the principles we claim to believe in? What price are we prepared to pay to create a more just and equitable world? The example of Nelson Mandela reminds us that true leadership requires not just vision and eloquence, but the courage to act when action is necessary, even when that action comes at great personal cost. The fire that burned within Mandela, the fire of justice, of human dignity, of unwavering commitment to freedom, must burn within each of us if we are to create the world we want to see. The call echoes across generations. Will you answer it with the same courage that Mandela showed when he chose to fight for freedom, knowing it might cost him everything? The struggle for justice is not a relic of the past. It is the defining challenge of our time, and it demands nothing less than everything we have to give.